Good morning. Today is the 18th day of Sivan, the 7th of June. And we're going to go a little bit backwards to the third reading. And the third reading has one of the most incredible stories. It's incredible not because it's so different. It's just the commentary around it is tremendous. It says we're looking at Numbers 9:1. So God said to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai, in the second year when they came out of Egypt, in the first month. So the second year of the first month is the month of Nisan. What does it mean that it's the second year? Because what did they do? They left on the 15th of Nisan in 2448. Then on the 6th of Sivan they received the Torah at Mount Sinai, 49 days later, 50 days later. But things didn't go so well. So what happened was that they built the golden calf 40 days later. Moses had to go up for another 40 days and another 40 days. So he came back down for the third time on Yom Kippur, basically the 10th of Tishrei of 2449 already. That's when he brought down the second tablets. One of the things that happened that changed was... Oh, sorry, you can't see me. One of the things that changed was that now God had commanded to build the tabernacle. That wasn't in the original plan, because the original plan was from Mount Sinai to go to the land of Canaan, to turn it into the land of Israel, and to build the temple in Jerusalem, or where God would have shown them, which would have been Jerusalem later. So that didn't happen, and they spent the next 3 months building the tabernacle. On the 25th of Kislev of 2449, they finished the tabernacle, and they stowed it away for 3 months. And they brought it out on God's command on the 23rd of Adar of that year, 3 months later. And they erected it and took it apart for 7 days. Until the first day of Nisan. And the first day of Nisan of 2449, they erected it and didn't take it apart anymore. And that's when the story that we read in Parashat Naso happens, that the princes, the kings of the tribes, bring their offerings. And that was for 12 days, the inauguration of the temple, of the tabernacle. Now, we don't know exactly on what day, but usually when it says in the first month, so it was the first of Nisan, even before all that we read in Naso happened, the previous parsha, God said to them to make a Passover. And one might ask, why? Isn't it clear that when the 15th day of Nisan comes about, you make a Passover? So why does he have to give a special command? And then it says, and the Israelites made the Passover in its time. That's the second verse. Rashi says something really shocking. He says, really the book of Numbers should have started with this story, that God commanded them to make a Passover that year. However, because this was the first thing that happened actually. It was before everything else that we saw, because it was on the first day of Nisan. After that, he commanded them to make a census. After that, on the same day, the kings of the tribes began bringing the offerings. And only after all that was finished did they make a census of the Levites, which is what we read at the end of Naso. So all this happened first. So why didn't the book of Numbers start with this? This would actually have been something even better, because the Passover is a sign of God's endearing connection to the Jewish people, that he saved them from Egypt. So Rashi says he should have started with this. But he explains the reason that he didn't, because it is, if he would have done that, then it would have been a negative light. It would have cast a negative light on the Jewish people. Why, says Rashi? Because for the next 38 years, they didn't celebrate Passover. They only celebrated this one. So what does one usually understand? What Rashi means is they only celebrated this one, and the next 38 they missed, like I missed yesterday. because they fell asleep, because they didn't, whatever. But that doesn't make any sense. Why would they not keep the Passover? What was the reason? So a lot of people know this reason that is brought in the Tosafot. Tosafot is the commentaries of Rashi's children, mostly his, well, not his children, he had 3 daughters, but of his grandchildren, who are called the Tosafot. And they were the sages in France in the 12th and 13th and 14th century, considered to be a very, probably the deepest thinkers in terms of Talmudic thought. So a lot of people know that one of the answers that they give to this question is, they say that they couldn't circumcise when they were in the wilderness. Why could they not circumcise? Because there's one of the laws of circumcision is that you should stay. It's not exactly a law; it's more of a custom, but it's even stronger than a halacha. It's stronger than a law, because what it says is that when you are in a place that you can't rest for 3 days, you shouldn't circumcise a child, because it's dangerous. It needs, the child or the adult, whoever it is, needs 3 days of rest after the circumcision. And they say that because they didn't know when they would need to travel, because maybe they would be commanded to travel that day, the next day, the third day even. So since it was, as far as they were concerned, they couldn't count on being in the same place for 3 days, so they couldn't circumcise the children. And because of that, there were many uncircumcised children, and therefore they didn't celebrate the Passover, because you have to be circumcised to eat from the Paschal lamb. Now that's an answer, but it's not such a good answer, because, okay, so there's people who were not circumcised, but all the rest are. Everybody else was circumcised before they came out of Egypt. So the vast majority, at least for the next 20 years, are going to be circumcised, probably even more than that. So why not celebrate the Passover? So the ones who can eat will eat from the Paschal lamb. The ones who can't won't. So that's not a very good answer. But Tosafot gives a different answer, which is not usually commonly known, but it's a tremendous answer. And they say that if we open the book of Exodus, when they came out of Egypt, there's an incredible verse there that says, I'm looking at Exodus 12:25, when you come to the land, meaning the land of Canaan, land of Israel, Asher yiten Hashem lachem, that God will give to you as He spoke, Ushmartem et ha'avodah azot, you shall keep this service. Which service? Here it's talking about the Paschal lamb. If you look at Exodus 12, you'll see that it's talking about all the laws of the Passover. And so they had an understanding, says Tosafot, that really to celebrate Passover is intrinsically linked to being in the land of Israel. There's actually no Passover outside of the land of Israel, except the exception was that God told them to make one Passover in Egypt when they were still there. But it didn't have the same laws. For instance, there was no problem with having unleavened bread in your home. It was perfectly fine. You had to have matzah, but you could also have bread at the same time. So there are many, many things that were different. And not only that, there's many other things. We're not going to get into them. So they understood that really Passover, with all the laws of not having leavened bread, leavened chametz, everything that is leavened, that is only in the land of Israel. And really you don't bring the Paschal lamb until you come to the land of Israel. And so it says Tosafot that they had to receive in this week's Parsha, in Exodus 9, in Numbers 9:1, they had to receive a special instruction, a special command to keep the Passover in the wilderness. But they never received that command again. Afterwards, what happened? Next week's Parsha will be Shlach Lecha, and there we read about the spies that Moses sent. And he didn't really send them as spies, he sent them as emissaries. They turned into spies because they decided that their task was different than what Moses had assigned them with. And when they came back and they said that the land cannot be conquered and so on and so forth, so then God commanded them to stay in the wilderness for another 38 years. And so it's an interesting thing that that after that, for 38 years, they didn't keep the Passover because, again, they still held by that teaching that they had received in Egypt, that the Passover belongs to the land of Israel and not outside. And so because they didn't receive a special instruction like they did in this week's Parsha, so they didn't keep any more Passovers. So that's the usual answer of what does it mean that it would shine a negative light on the Jewish people, because what does it do now? It reminds us that the fact that they didn't keep 38 Passovers was because of the sin of the spies. So therefore, the Torah didn't want to start the story of Passover, to start with that, the book of Numbers. But there's a little bit of a problem there. Why is it a little bit of a problem? Because actually, this had not happened yet. Meaning, I would read in the beginning of Numbers that they kept the Passover, that God gave them a special instruction. And they kept the Passover. I wouldn't shed a negative light yet until I would read about the sin of the spies. So it's not that clear cut that this is the explanation that Rashi was thinking of. Because of that, the Lubavitcher Rebbe gives a tremendously amazing answer. I think this is it's like a lightning strike. He says, right after we hear that they were commanded to keep the Passover, there were people that came. There were those men who had become ritually defiled, and they could not offer the Passover sacrifice in that day, in this second year that they're in the wilderness, and they're commanded to keep the Passover, so they couldn't keep it. So they came and asked God, and they said, what should we do? We want to keep Passover also. We want to eat from the Paschal Lamb. So what did God do? He gave them a special commandment, which is like not even it wasn't even on the charts before. Nobody knew about it. Called Second Passover. And Second Passover means that you get a second opportunity. If you were defiled or you were far away, you couldn't keep the first Passover, you got a second chance. So says the Rebbe, that what do we learn from this? That if you're in a situation where you can't keep a mitzvah, all you have to do is cry out to God and say, find me a solution. And says the Rebbe, that is the real reason it would shed a negative light on them, that they didn't keep the Passover for 38 more years. Because why didn't they say anything? They should have, in the same way that those who were defiled and couldn't keep it, asked for a solution. God gave it to them. So even though they were in the wilderness, they could have asked God and said, oh, it's very nice that you want us to keep the Passover. What do we do now? Now we're here for another 38 years. How do we do it now? And God would have found a solution for them. And so he says that's the real deep reason about why it would shed a negative light. But if that's true, says the Rebbe, so all the more so about us. We've been in exile without a temple for 2,000 years. Why don't we cry out and say, God, we don't have a temple, find us a solution? He says that's the negative light that the Torah didn't want to start with. So the whole story of the Passover here, first of all, this thing that usually is not known, that Passover was commanded, apparently, not to be kept in the wilderness, only in the land of Israel. Afterwards, once it was kept in the land of Israel, so we keep it even after we're out of the land of Israel, but it remains the same. But originally the intent was to go straight from Egypt to the land of Israel, and the second Passover was supposed to have been, meaning the second time they commemorated the Passover should have been in the land of Israel. But because they weren't there, because of the sin of the golden calf, so God gave a special commandment. That's the first novel idea here. The second is that you can learn from this, that whenever you're missing something in keeping the mitzvot, of being close to God, you have to cry out to Him. That's the whole point of the second Passover. So don't leave it and just say, okay, it is what it is. This is how things are. In whatever a person has any trouble with, particularly in connecting with God, he should cry out to God and say, I need your solution to help me figure this out. Hope to see everyone tomorrow at 8:15 Eastern Time, 6:15 Pacific Time.